Hey, pal, or I guess really supposed to say howdy, partner. I'm so glad you're here today. I did wear my hat. We're talking all about Cowboys today, but I'm really thrilled to have you on the show today, and I think this is going to be a lot of fun. Gordon, part of being a baby boomer is looking back at some of the life lessons that we've had in all this, and I know growing up in Dalton, Dalton was a small town, really played a big role in your life. Talk about growing up in a town like Dalton and what that meant.
It was, in fact, the guys that I went to school with, now that we're all old and, reminisce, it was really like Camelot. It was amazing. And I think it was, probably several fold. One is just a ton of great families that were really brought together predominantly because of the rise of the carpet industry, to be honest. It was so, the 60s is when the carpet industry really hit its stride, and it created a lot of earning opportunity for people, a lot, which one of the things that really struck me at an early age is, even though all these people competed with each other, they came together for schools, for the recreation department, for anything that was for the community. Even though they were competitors out there in the carpet industry, different companies, different leadership, they came together to make Dalton a better place, and that reflected itself in, we had the best sports teams, we had the best arts and entertainment, we had just all the things that you know really made it feel like Camelot, particularly when you went to visit other places, or when you go to college and you talk to other people about how they grew up. We were very fortunate, around a lot of strong families, and a great industry that fueled, much like, other people's, hometowns.
Well, it's interesting that, and one of the things I admire about you is you've remained close. You're still great friends with a lot of those guys that you grew up with and played sports with. My mother always had a great saying. She would say, um, meet new friends, but keep the old. One is silver, one is gold, and I like that. And sports was a big part of your life there. I
No,
mean, and
no
and
doubt.
became a big part of your career.
No doubt. In fact, part of the reason that I, went into, college football coaching early in my career was, I grew up with an amazing group of coaches across every sport. I was predominantly football, baseball, and track, and the again, back to this community and the investment that really these families made in everything Dalton. The coaching staffs were incredible and great men, and it seems so funny now at our, sitting here at our age, to think how young those guys were when we were coming up. We thought of them as, these really icons, which they were, but they were super young, at the time. But they were so principled and so focused on things that would help all of us later in life, that we all look back so fondly. Our head football coach passed away not too long ago, and it was, I mean, the funeral was both a blessing, and it was also emotional, just to see all these people come back and celebrate a man's life who was so influential on all of us.
Well, you knew that Bill Battle was such a mentor to me, and when I went to his funeral earlier this year, I was amazed at the number of former Tennessee players that came.
Yep.
I think there were like 48,
Yeah.
former players that were, again, all in their 70s, because Bill Battle was such a young college coach. In a previous episode of Shaboom, we talked a little bit about my basketball career, and I was a 25-year-old head coach. And when we went back for our reunion last year, all of my guys were 60. you know,
Yeah.
I mean, I was like, well, who are all these old guys? Well, these
Yeah.
are my
That's right.
players.
Yeah.
I did tell everybody they acted like they were 19 all weekend. I mean, they were goofy like ever. But it's funny, the bonds that you have with coaches and with teammates and all that. And speaking of Bill Battle, then you went to Tennessee, and talk
Yeah.
about a little bit about Tennessee and how that had an impact on your life.
It was a great, it was a great experience. it was not without challenges. When I came here out of high school, signed out of high school to play baseball here, and just to be as blunt as possible, I was terrible. I played so poorly, and it was such an awakening to me that hey, you got to work harder than you did, and when I got cut here, I my goal all along had been to coach college football anyway. So once they gave me sort of an offer to go to a junior college and sort of hone my skills and come back. And at that point, I was like, I want to coach college football. So I went, once I got cut, I just went over to and started working for the football team and Coach Majors and his staff, and that really set me on my path. And so it was it was a real fortunate time for me because as one of the things about Coach Majors was very difficult to work for. He's very demanding, and so he recycled a lot of coaches. Well, for a young guy like me that was trying to get into coaching, it was kind of an unforeseen blessing because I got to meet so many coaches, in my 4 years here, that when I went out to start my career, gosh, I knew people all over, sort of the landscape of football, and it was so yeah, everything that happened to me here was was a real blessing, just to have come here,
You know,
even
I've
though it
always,
started out kind of rocky.
yeah, I've always felt that coaches are kind of the last of the Cowboys too. I mean, the attributes of a Cowboy and the attribute of coach are very, very similar, I think, in a lot of ways. And so when you went out to Oklahoma State, now you're really in Cowboy country.
Yeah.
As a coach, talk a little bit about Oklahoma State and how that kind of influenced you. And let me ask you this: were you always a fan of Cowboys and
I was,
Western
but
and
from a young
horses?
age,
And
I mean,
yeah,
there are, there are pictures of me as a child running around with cowboy hat, and my sidearms, and just you know and some that my kids loved and make fun of me is me running around with no clothes on and a cowboy hat. So when I was a little boy, but yeah, I always had a passion for the West. I'm not, I don't know, I can't pinpoint it exactly, but as a child, I was enamored with the West. And I think that's really, I was, as you know, born in '63. So about that time is, I think, when the Western, Gunsmoke was in its prime. I mean, all these shows, The Rifleman, all these things were really starting to captivate America and celebrate what went on in the 18 post Civil War, if you will, when people started going west and seeking a new life, and Hollywood did a good job of capturing that back then. But when I went to Oklahoma State, yeah, it accentuated my love, for the West. I was always, as I said, sort of passionate about it. But then I got out there and it got real. Now it was funny though, because I was so young, Rick, and I wanted to, appear older than I was so that people wouldn't think I was so young in such a big profession, that for lack of a better description, I overdressed all the time. So now, as you know, when you see me, I'm in predominantly jeans and a cowboy hat. Even if I'm in a tux, I'm in a cowboy hat. And, but back then I was coat and tie, almost every day. Um, at 22, 23 years old, because I wanted people to take me more seriously than, you know, thinking I was too young. So it's funny. Even though I was there for 3, 4 years at Oklahoma State, I could probably count on one hand the days I wore jeans, just because of that. But I really did. It absolutely, accentuated and just emphasized my love for the West while I was out there. And I'll never forget telling my parents when, they were like, well, what's it like? Because I loaded up my Honda Accord my last day at Tennessee and drove, 1,000 miles or whatever to Stillwater, Oklahoma. and I never been there, and so it was just fun to sort of see oil wells and horses everywhere, and it was just a whole new adventure. See the sunset in a different way, and it really does. It has a romanticism about it that, and you're seeing it, as you know, replay itself right now with all the, where Taylor Sheridan has certainly struck a nerve with Yellowstone and all the, 1883, 1923, all those. Whether you're an American or, you know, overseas, there's this romanticism is the best way I can say it about the West that is unique to America.
A lot of people don't know this, but Marlboro cigarettes was perceived as a cigarette for women, and Marlboro needed to change not the makeup of their cigarette, but their image, and they decided to hitch their wagon to the Cowboy. The first Marlboro man was a football star named Charlie Connolly. He was the first Marlboro man,
Wow.
which is wild. So again, that Cowboy football connection was interesting, that he was the one that was chosen to be able to do that. But I think today, you mentioned Taylor Sheridan and what's going on today. I think it reflects where we are as a country too. I think we're back kind of yearning for a day where your word was your word. You made your own way. You looked after people. Small town. It's interesting, and I think at times when the cowboy culture we had the urban cowboy phenomenon a few years ago, came at a similar time. When Reagan was coming into office, and we were back to, and he was perceived as a cowboy, obviously,
That's right.
as a guy who grew up in Illinois, but found Hollywood, found the West, did all that. So I think there's something to that, and I know for our generation, what I call the cowboy culture made a deep impact on us in so many ways. But it's interesting, you made a pivot and you went into the carpet business, having grown up in a town that was the carpet business, and did extremely well there. But you never lost your love for sport. And you got involved with Host Communications, you got involved with Action Sports Media and some other things, but you also founded this thing called the U.S. Cowboy Tour. Talk about how, after the carpet business or during the carpet business, how you decided you wanted to exploit this lifestyle a little bit differently.
I will, but I want to go back to what you said about Taylor. I told my wife, the night of the election, and not, I don't want to get too deep into politics here, but
But we can. We
obviously,
do it every week. It's okay.
but the country obviously did. It was a pretty resounding, in my opinion, in our lifetime, a resounding sort of statement the way the election went. And I told Susie, I said, I've met Taylor Sheridan. I wouldn't say I know Taylor Sheridan, but because of my work on the National Cowboy Museum, I've got, I met him a couple of times. And I said, when I see him again, I'm going to say, you had a direct impact on the election. I mean, I think Yellowstone and all of that struck a nerve in America where it was okay to be masculine again. It was okay to be, and even his female characters, it's okay for women to be tough. It's okay for, from his background and whatever, he struck a nerve, which was pretty incredible. But to your point, yeah, I was coaching at Oklahoma State. Was living my life's dream, to be honest, Rick. Was and never intended doing anything else other than coaching college football. And they asked me to go find some free carpet for the athletic department because I was from Dalton, Georgia. And strangely enough, I called back home and I said, "Hey, I don't even, at that time, I really knew nothing about the carpet industry other than it helped raise me. So I found my way to a guy named Charlie Idle, who was running a company called Collins and Aitman. It was a commercial carpet company in Dalton. And he was an Oklahoma State graduate, as fate would have it. And so I called him just as brash as I could be, as, a 22, 23-year-old, and said, hey, here's who I am. And, um, I know you went to school here, and we need some free carpet for the athletic department facilities. And he said, oh, well, look, I'm coming out to speak to the business school in October. Let's sit down and have breakfast. So we sat down at breakfast, and I put this big pitch on him like a recruiting coordinator would do, about how he needed to give us free carpet. And about halfway through my pitch, he stopped me and he said, hey, look, I'm going to give you the carpet, but I want you to come to work for me. And it stunned me, and I was, he said, and he was smart. He's a pretty darn good recruiter himself. I said, look, I'm living my live stream. I appreciate it, but I really don't have any interest. And he said, well, look, you're off next weekend. Why don't you fly home? I'll pay for you to fly home, see your family. You can take a tour of the facilities. No harm, no foul. So I did. And there was something about this guy. He had some, when I started US Cowboy, I started on the premise that there's a little cowboy in everybody. And this dude certainly had
He had that cowboy in him, didn't
yeah.
he? Yeah.
And so I, was attracted to his leadership skills and what he was about. And to make a long story short, I left and did that. And to your point, the whole time I was in the carpet industry, and we were 6 years at two different companies. So I had a 12-year run with him, we were very fortunate, as you mentioned, and we had some really nice success. But there was everybody that worked with me knew that in the back, I was always going to be back in sports and business. I talked about it probably too much, back then. And so when I had the chance, when we sort of left the carpet industry, the next day I was really looking for what was next, and we started United States Cowboy Tour, which has taken on a lot of different lives, but it's 25 years old this year, and has been a real adventure. And Susie would say, and she was right, in the early days, an expensive adventure of Gordon's, but it's been a real blessing in our lives for a number of reasons.
Well, for the listeners out there, if you haven't been to a rodeo, you got to put it on your bucket list.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's just one of the great American institutions.
The prayer and the national anthem.
The prayer and the anthem, exactly.
Are the two things that, there's just nothing like, the American flag, somebody carrying it on horseback in the middle of the arena, and the national anthem there's just nothing like it.
Well, the prayer is the prayer that we're going to compete today, and we don't want anybody to get hurt.
That's right.
I mean, and it's real, because you can get hurt.
Yeah.
You can get hurt badly. And there have been great Cowboys that have died because of the sport. But it's just something amazing about the audience, the town, the venue, the Cowboys, the animals, that I think special. And you, with the U.S. Cowboy Tour, put on so many of those, and then you supported so many other rodeos through, media, digital streaming, television, all sorts of different things that I think is really cool. You also had a chance to work for what I call another Cowboy, another Oklahoma State graduate, Boone Pickens. When you talk about Cowboys in business, that guy came to mind. Because
he was in American business, certainly one of the five ultimate cowboys, if you will, that people really knew and respected worldwide. Even if you disagreed with him, which plenty of people did, you had to respect his principles, what he stood for. Back to your point about, he never forgot that he came from Holdenville, Oklahoma, He just was one of those, once in a lifetime unique Americans that comes along that in fact, in my office, it's funny. I met him for the first time in 1989 at a Young Republicans meeting in Dallas. I was a salesman for Collins and Aitman at the time, and a friend of mine, Lee Sanders, invited me to go with him to hear Boone speak. And Boone was contemplating at the time a run for governor of Texas. He just moved to Dallas and was thinking about it, and from Amarillo, and he was thinking about it. And so I've got this. I have it. Susie framed. He sent me a personal letter back, which Boone was very big on, and that impacted my life as well. Like I wanted to emulate that, and then he also sent me 4 caricatures that sit on my wall of what people were writing about him, because they talked about him as a corporate raider. And when he was late in life, and when I say late in life, in his 80s, he was saying to me, they call me a corporate raider, but they call Carl Icahn an activist. He's like, the terminology is so much gentler, now, but, because he was a raider. But what he was is, and what you see today is he was, he wanted shareholder value for the shareholders. And so he was always focused on that. But being around him, certainly, at the time of in my career, I think I started working with him in 2009, maybe, and went 10 years, as an advisor to he and his team. It was, I mean, the stuff I learned and the stuff I saw was really beyond comprehension to see what, this guy. I mean, it's a great story. He used to say he made more money after he was 70 years old than he made his entire career. I mean, that gives us all hope, Rick.
It does, and it ought to give all our listeners, these baby boomers out there, that
Think about that.
there's still plenty of time to do that. Interestingly, my heroes have always been capitalists who risk capital. I
Right.
mean, people forget that to have a business, somebody has to risk capital, and it's a risk. There's no guarantees in business, but like I know people, and I'm a big fan of Bob Iger's at the Walt Disney Company, but I'm a bigger fan of Walt Disney.
Yeah, sure.
I'm a fan of Bill Battle, who created an industry, or Bob Cohn, who went out and created stuff. The cowboy entrepreneur, and Boone was simply that. I mean,
He
he was a
was.
self-made man.
He
Um,
was, and to your point, because his story is really, if you've never followed it, you can, he wrote a couple books, and one was called Boone, and the other was the First Billion is the Hardest, which is really a good book. But to your point, I mean, and I can say even at 62 years old sitting here, I had the privilege of running very big companies, as you know, in the carpet industry. Um, my last position was, CEO of a $750 million enterprise with 4,000 employees. And then, like I said, I literally went and started United States Cowboy Tour with me and me only. And I can tell you, I have unbelievable respect for any entrepreneur, because I would tell you, and I'm not being self-deprecating, I'm an average entrepreneur, and I mean that. I'm not a great one. We've done okay, and but I have great respect for the entrepreneurs who like Elon Musk or Boone Pickens, or people that are truly transformational, who, or just the guy down the street who's got a dry cleaner, or the lady who's got a restaurant or whatever. I'm to It is hard, you know, to make payroll, to deal with all the reporting you got to do as an entrepreneur. Whereas in a big company, you got people that do that. I used to laugh when I started US Cowboy. I said, an interface would be, 10 people touch the phone before I'd ever, before they could ever get, to me whereas, I was walking across the street getting my own paper at Staples, and it's quite a bit different.
No, it really is. And again, it takes courage, I think, to be an entrepreneur and to be a cowboy in that way, and still maintain your values and do some of the right kinds of things along those lines. Tell me about the future now, the future of the U.S. Cowboy Tour. It's a .com business in a lot of
Yeah.
ways. It's a media company. Talk about where you want to take it, what you want to do with it.
So as we started our 25th year, and a lot about the company's history. So, we in the early days we did for about 5 years we did our own events, and we were our own sort of sanctioning body. Then we took over and ran the Professional Rodeo Cowboys Association's Extreme Bulls Tour for about 9 years, and we managed that under their brand. We were the operating company, so we were kind of behind the scenes. As you pointed out, then we moved because of all the history we had in streaming dating back to Host Communications. We teamed up, Sam Dunn and David Sharp, and I teamed up with Tim Campbell, who we'd worked with at Host, and who had his own company by that point called Blue Million. And we created the first live streaming, way before streaming was cool, the first live streaming rodeo network in America and the world. And we did that for about 10 years in a partnership with Wrangler. As somebody bought the rights later to all that sort of away from us, I wanted to do something different in our 25th year. So we started we went back to the original brand. We dropped tour. So now it's US Cowboy. It's uscowboy.com. And so we've recently launched at the start of 25 a news highlight content site around covering Western sports. So I kind of wanted it to be the ESPN news of Western sports. We are doing a little bit of streaming. We're live streaming the remaining PBR events for this year. And we're going to have, just like you are, a podcast that will launch shortly. Our headquarters at the Fort Worth Stockyards got a cool young man, Brett Nierengarten, who lives there and is running the company. So it's a passion for us. Our business here is still at the Whitener Company, still investing and consulting and doing the things that really we do. But I didn't want the brand to die. Not only did I not want it to die, I wanted to reinvigorate it and start something new with all the things we learned in digital.
That's
Pretty
pretty
excited about
exciting.
it.
Yeah, that's pretty exciting. Jim Host's partner, Chuck Jarvie, told me a long time ago, and I love Chuck. He's told me one day, he sent me down, he said, Rick, you're never going to make any real money. And I said, well, why is that, Chuck? He said, because you get bored too easily. And there's a lot of truth to that. And I earlier in the show, I talked about my hero being Flip McCullough, the Indian scout on Wagon Train. And I'm the guy that always wants to ride over the next hill. I'm always looking for greener pastures, something else. I don't want to be a farmer. This is just not in my. I'm not a farmer. I'm a cowboy. I want to get out. And you've been that and have had such a great success. I want to close today with, who's your favorite cowboy of all time and why?
Got to be John Wayne. Not only, there's a bunch of them. Obviously I've mentioned Boone Pickens, Ronald Reagan. I think Donald Trump is a hell of a cowboy, to be, just frank in current times. But John Wayne, I've had the real fortunate blessing to sit on the National Cowboy Museum Board of Directors for a long time now. And, John Wayne's family is part of it, is on the board, and they're very involved. And to get to know them, I also had a tremendous love for Will Rogers, because Will Rogers was a real cowboy, but also an entertainer and a very successful businessman. And, in fact, I told the young man who's running US Cowboy, I want to celebrate throughout our new history, a lot of John Wayne, a lot of Will Rogers, because I've gotten to know both families. But Wayne was, I think he was a man's man. I think, women were attracted to him because he was a man's man. He was strong, and he had an incredible ranching history, but on the silver screen, I mean, he epitomized, whether it was Hellfighters or Chisholm. He could play any role, and people rallied around that. And so he's probably, that's my, favorite, cowboy, both on the big screen. It is hard, not to love James Arness from Gunsmoke, and even Burt Reynolds. Burt Reynolds, who, as you know, we had the privilege to work with on his movie. Burt was, in Gunsmoke. He loved Gunsmoke, and he loved being a cowboy, and he loved all the things about the West as well. It was his favorite part of his career. I had many conversations with him about it, and he loved the West. So it's hard to pick just one, but if I had to, it'd be John Wayne.
Well, and John Wayne won the Academy Award for True Grit, which is one of the great
Unbelievable
cowboy movies of all time. And also, I want to remind everybody, John Wayne was a college football player at
Absolutely.
Southern
USC.
California, so there's a
USC.
connection to that. Well,
Yeah,
listen.
and so was Burt Reynolds.
Yeah, exactly. But I think
Florida
he was Lee Corso's roommate at
He was
Florida
State.
State.
And oddly enough, he played with Coach Major's brother Joe at Florida State. So when we filmed the movie here, Coach Majors came out to see Burt, and I've got an amazing picture of the two of them, meeting up and talking about those old days. It was pretty cool. So
That's very, very cool. Well, listen, I can't thank you enough for being with us today. You're a young baby boomer. You got a lot of cool things ahead. And so I'm going to close by saying, hey, pal, giddy up.
yeah, I appreciate that, Rick. Thank you for always being a friend and always being a leader in an industry that needs leadership. So I really appreciate you.
I appreciate you. See you, pal. Bye-bye.